Kevin Carnahan is professor of philosophy and religion at Central Methodist University in Fayette, Missouri. He served for 5 years as the co-editor of the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics and 3 years as president of the Niebuhr Society. He has authored several books on Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul RAMSEY, and From Presumption to Prudence in Just War Rationality. And he's the co-editor of a book called Paradoxical Virtue, Reinhold Niebuhr and the Virtue Tradition. That was published by Routledge in 2020. His enduring interest, Kevin's enduring interest, is in the politics of Israel and Palestine. And he's traveled frequently to the region. And his topic today, maintaining moral balance in Israel/Palestine. I hope one of the things that he'll talk to us about is just the title. Titles are very important. There's not the word "and" in between Israel/Palestine. And I'm sure that's a conscious decision that I might like to hear more about. Just the naming the region, as those of us familiar with it, is very important. Most of us are also painfully aware that the story there is a story of compounded historical tragedy. There is no solution to the conflict that fulfills all the requirements of justice. And in this type of context, it becomes tempting for participants in the conflict on all sides to deny the reality of at least some goods. And unfortunately, it's usually the goods of their opponents. And so Kevin's argument is that realistic moral analysis must resist such reductive rhetoric, count the costs, and take seriously the balance of power in the region. Such a vision is necessary, he feels, to find a way for Israel and Palestine to coexist at any point in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn our meeting over to Jay McDaniel to offer an additional welcome to Kevin, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Well, hello, Kevin. I'm so glad you're here. And I was lucky enough to be a colleague of Kevin's when he taught at Hendrix College, where I taught. And he was a great teacher. His colleagues loved him and learned from him, and so did the students. So Central College is very lucky to have him. And Kevin, we look forward to you sharing with us, and we all need to think about this. A brief hello from John Cobb, and then you're on. John, just give him a welcome, if you don't mind.
Well, I welcome you with great interest in hearing what you have to say. That's brief enough, I think.
Okay. Kevin, you're on. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all very much for having me. I'll just, by way of introduction, there's been a lot of wonderful things said about me, which I'm sure everyone will take back after I'm done. So I am at Central Methodist University. I've been a co-editor of the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, president of the Niebuhr Society. But in this context, I should probably say something about my own background with process theology. So I went in 1999 down to Southern Methodist University in search of Schubert Ogden. Lots of the ministers that I had been with in churches had gone to Southern Methodist University during the time that Ogden was a professor there, and told me what a wonderful place it was and how much they had learned. Unfortunately, by the time that I got there, Schubert Ogden had retired. And so I had to pick up books by people like this guy, John Cobb, and David Ray Griffin, and learn about process theology there. And then I was gifted to work with Jay at Hendrix. So in one way or another, I've been in conversation with process theology for most of my life. Now, that said, I went to SMU and I eventually got a PhD in Christian ethics. And the focus of my study was on Reinhold Niebuhr. I studied with Robin Lovin there. And if anybody knows anything about Niebuhr, he was a political theorist, but more than a political theorist, he was really a commentator. Political theology and political philosophy were never separate from the practical, actual on-the-ground issues that were happening in the world. And so as I did my work on Niebuhr, I was also attentive to lots of the politics that was happening in the world. And I was especially interested in Israel, Palestine. And I had the opportunity to travel there several times, a couple of times sponsored by the State Department, and to have the opportunity to go around and have meetings with scholars at Al-Quds University and other universities in the area, and be able to attend and talk to lots of the people in the area. Really had a wonderful time with that. I was also able then, in my book From Presumption to Prudence in Just War Rationality, to use Israel, Palestine, and some of their conflict as a kind of case study in working out some of the just war thought that I was developing in the book. I was saying to Richard before we came in that this is a kind of unfortunate area to be an expert in, because every time your expertise is needed, it seems like there's something bad going on. There are very few positive developments in Israel, Palestine, really since the Clinton administration. There hasn't been much that has moved in the right direction in the conflict and in the region. So getting into my discussion of maintaining moral balance in Israel, Palestine, I want to follow that kind of general picture that was laid out at the beginning through the kind of summary of my talk. And I'm going to put this in the form of 3 different points that I'm going to go through. So the first point is that there is no entirely just resolution to the conflict in Israel-Palestine. I use Israel-Palestine to refer to the land, and I'll have an opportunity to talk about the problems of reference and the problems of language as we go. That actually comes up under my second point, which is that the desire to represent one side as just, or to construe a possible solution as absolutely just, leads to efforts to erase one of the 2 sides in the conflict over Israel-Palestine. And then my third point, which will really get us into the mess of things, is that the power imbalance between Israel-Palestine further complicates the issue of moral description as we get into analyzing what's happening in Israel-Palestine. So with those 3 points lined out, I'm going to go back to the first one, which is that there is no entirely just resolution to the conflict in Israel-Palestine. In order to talk about this, it's helpful to talk about chains of injustice. Actually, Robert Nozick, who's a libertarian philosopher but does some interesting work in justice, points out that justice, any account of justice, is incomplete if you don't have an account of how you got to the particular situation that you're in. And this is something I think that we're fairly aware of as we think about racial justice issues in the United States and issues of reparations. We're aware of these issues, even if we aren't very good at dealing with them. So it helps when we go to Israel-Palestine to think about chains of justice and injustice in how we got to the present moment. Currently, Palestinians are suffering. They're suffering under bombings from Israel, and this is especially being borne by civilians and children in Gaza. And we can ask who's at fault for that? And in part, obviously, the answer is Israel, who is bombing buildings. We can get into the details of exactly how they target and how they try to avoid civilian casualties. And there's a whole current debate about a hospital that was bombed there. But it's important to note that at the same time, responsibility has to be split between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is the political organization in Gaza, and they are structured so as to often be underneath civilian targets. They will often build their sites, their depots, their bases in tunnels underneath civilian targets so that it's very hard to get at them without going through civilian targets on the way. And now, why is all that happening? Well, that is happening, of course, because Hamas attacked Israel and attacked it in a way that was morally shocking. Not only shocking in its strategic success, but shocking in what they did, that they came out, they took many civilians captive, they killed many civilians. There were a whole set of atrocities that they committed against Israel. Of course, then we could ask, why did they do that? And that was in response to Israel, which has for a decade cut off Gaza from the rest of both Egypt and Israel and basically maintained it as a kind of prison city that access is only allowed to in response to Israel allowing goods in and out. And so in some sense, the poor economy in Gaza, the lack of goods is related to Israel and Israel's limitations on things going into Gaza. And then we could ask, okay, whose fault was that? Well, Israel did that, of course, in response to rockets that got shot out of Gaza on about a yearly basis up until 2021. There was a practice in Israel that they eventually just called mowing the grass, where Hamas would, at some point during the year, shoot out rockets. Their rockets were not particularly good. They were not high technology rockets. They didn't have much effect, but Israel would then go in, they would bomb significant parts of Gaza, basically knocking them back down. And then it would be another year until the two of them went at it again. Of course, we can do this all day. We can go back and forth between the different parties and each one pointing out the thing that the other one did in order to land us where we are. And to some extent, in this argument, everyone is going to have a point, because every step in this process inevitably involves overreaction, destruction, and oftentimes the will to eliminate the other party from its own existence. Now, of course, this all goes back to 1947, when the United Nations declared the state of Israel in Israel, Palestine. And at that time, the United Nations awarded about 55% of Israel, Palestine to the Jewish state, which at that time had about 33% of the populace in the region. Now, of course, there's another question, which is what justification did the UN have? What right did the UN have to even be partitioning the land in this case? Why were they doing that? And of course, in order to get to that, so this is what will lead to the displacement of the Palestinians and set a whole set of dominoes going. But we have to go back further than that, of course, to understand why it was that the UN did that. And we have to go back to the Holocaust. And there we finally find a domino that is at least not in the immediate region that leads to a cause here, which is Germany and the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, for justifiable reasons, the West, and primarily it was the West that were the victors in World War II and who ended up setting themselves in charge of the United Nations, They recognized the utter failure in Germany, and they felt guilty for their own failures in not recognizing, not sufficiently responding to not only the Holocaust, but a series of anti-Semitic events that led up to the Holocaust. In the United States, we like to think of ourselves as anti-Nazi and as never having been anti-Semitic. But of course, that is a narrative that pretty much started during World War II. Because we were fighting against the Nazis, we decided that we were going to define ourselves against them. That did not fit with most of American culture that had come immediately preceding, where American culture was often deeply anti-Semitic. And even in the run-up to World War II, America was turning Jews away who were trying to run away from the atrocities that were happening in Germany. Now, if we go back to that point, I mean, we could go back further, of course, because we could look at Germany and why what happened in Germany, going back to World War I and the end of World War I. But I think this goes back far enough to point out that we've got a long chain of injustices that leads through a set of dominoes falling to the current state, where everyone in some sense feels like they're reacting against a previous injustice, and everybody's at some point trying to do what they see to be just, but inevitably, since it's a part of this chain of injustices, every reaction brings about new feelings of injustice, because the fundamental injustice of the system is never resolved. From the very beginning, as Israel gets placed in the land, Israel feels that it has been under attack. The people of Israel feel that they have been under attack, and of course they have in the Holocaust, and they feel that they are due their own land. Israel starts out on the basis of security Zionism, not on the basis of religious Zionism. But if you look back at figures like Theodor Herzl, they were really arguing for security. They needed a place for their own defense, their own police, their own army. And that required the creation of a nation state in the starkest terms, oftentimes in ways that we don't even think of nation states anymore. The United States is not really a nation state. It's a pluralist state. A lot of white nationalists would like for it to be a kind of nation state, an ethno state that represents, say, Europeans or their representation of white. But the United States is not really a nation state in that sense. The only place that we really find nation states anymore are primarily in areas like Denmark, where they have, in fact, maintained a kind of cultural ethnic core that maintains the majority of the state and is able to control electoral politics there. Israel, in order to establish Israel as a state that would be able to provide for the security of the Jewish people, it needed to be a nation state. It needed to be an ethno state. And so that goal, which in its own context made sense after the Holocaust, inevitably required undertaking a set of actions that would lead to a state that could not be fully democratic in any substantive sense. Because even if the boundaries that the UN had set up at the time had held, the majority of the people in the land were just barely Jewish. And the Palestinian peoples that were there, it turned out, reproduced on a faster pace than the Jewish people. So from the time it was set up, in order to maintain it as a Jewish ethno-state, you needed to evacuate Palestinian families from their land and move them out. That was just a requirement. The logic of the founding of the State of Israel required that. And that basically happened during the war that followed in 1947, as different Arab countries attacked the new state of Israel, which itself was, of course, problematic because at that point, Israel does have some claim it needs a place of its own security. It's attacked by these other nation states, but Israel, in part because its links to the West's superior military technology, they fight back. And people in the midst of this do what people do during a war. They pick up and they move out of the way of the tanks and the bombs and everything that's going on. And they did so thinking, this is a war, it'll happen, we'll be able to move back to our homes. Israel, for the most part, there might have been individual members who did this intentionally, but for the most part, their goal was not the movement of people outside the land, but the movement of people outside the land to the borders of the land from Palestine served the interests of the Israeli nation state, the ethno-state, because it did move people outside of the boundaries that Israel was then going to set. And so when the war was done, Israel set its boundaries. It set its boundaries at an even wider space than the UN had given to it. And it set those boundaries and did not allow people to come back into the land and retake their traditional homesteads. So Israel claimed that on the basis of its war gains, it should have those lands that it had gained in 1947. And again, that was probably necessary in order to have a state of Israel that was going to function the way that the state of Israel was conceived to function. Now, of course, the Palestinian people at this point feel that they have been abused, and with justification for this. Those who picked up and left thinking that they would be able to return to those lands that they had been on before, and after the war, they found themselves dispossessed of their lands outside, either in Jordan, in Egypt, or in one of the territories, the West Bank and Gaza, which were kind of middle grounds. There wasn't anything really coherently set up, but this was thought that this would be the new Palestine. Of course, after that, there were further wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and Israel eventually occupies both the West Bank and Gaza. In part, again, there are justifications for this in terms of Israel's security. Israel, or the West Bank and Gaza, had become staging grounds for attacks into Israel, and without any established authority in the West Bank or Gaza, Israel held with some justification that there needed to be an organized government that was providing for security in these regions. And so its occupation there was not without justification, but again, it leads to an even greater dispossession of the people of Palestine, as now they basically function as people who are held in under the power of Israel, but have no say in the place of Israel. And at this point, the requirement of anti-democratic status of the state is really established, because Israel cannot allow the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza to have, say, a vote in the state of Israel without losing the state of Israel as a Jewish ethno-state that functions primarily to preserve the people of Israel. Now, at this point, I think we can see that this chain of injustice has led to a situation where we have two peoples, the peoples of Israel and the peoples of Palestine, who have both suffered historical injustices, and who both feel with some justification that they have a claim on this land. Their justifications are different from each other, but each one has some moral claim to the place that they are staked down in. And the problem at this point is that if you want a resolution to the situation that recognizes any of each of these claims, no one is going to get what they will recognize as a fully just resolution to what's happening, because Israel will say, right, we have a justification to the land of Israel and our absolute security, which has to be gained then through the occupation of these borderlands because there is no functional government over them. While the Palestinians say, well, you've come into this land, displaced us, and we demand the right of return. We think that Israel should not be here and that we should have a Palestinian state that can be reestablished. Now, what this does is it gives a kind of veto power to troublemakers on either side. Because if any side decides that they want to make peace, they're going to have to compromise, and they're going to have to compromise on goods which the people with some justification believe are rightly theirs. So if Palestinians, if the PA, the Palestinian Authority, ever actually decided to make an agreement with Israel, they would have to trade off land in an exchange. And inevitably, they would get much less than their populace believes that they should have. If Israel is going to make an agreement, Israel will have to accept greater dangers to its own security than most Israelis want to accept, because they will be forced to move their forces back from the lands of the West Bank and Gaza, and there will always be spoilers in the West Bank and Gaza who will want to shoot rockets into Israel, at least for the foreseeable future. It will be impossible to stop that, even if you did get a rather functional government in Palestine. This means that there is no absolutely just resolution to the conflict. But now to go on to point number 2, which is that the effort to present a solution as if it is just oftentimes leads the people involved to erase each other in this debate. And I'm just going to go first with the ways that Israel will attempt to erase Palestinians, and then I'll go the opposite way around. Depending on which side of the issue people stand on, I'm never sure how many of my claims are going to be controversial, because everything in this debate is often subject to contestation on every side. So one of the ways that Israel or Israelis, pro-Israelis, often try and erase the Palestinians is with a claim to the ancient right of Israel. So the claim that the people of Israel were the native inhabitants of this land. And so it's actually other people that have moved in on what was always the land of Israel over time. You can see this in lots of popular ways. There's a joke at one point that Yasser Arafat and one of the presidents of Israel were at a dinner together, and the president of Israel got up and he said, well, I want to tell you a story about once when Moses was back in the land of Israel, and he decided to go skinny dipping one day. And so he left his clothes off to the side and he went and he dove into this pool. And it was at that point that a Palestinian came up and they grabbed his clothes and ran away with them, at which point Yasser Arafat gets up and he said, that did not happen because there were no Palestinians then. And at that point, the president of Israel turns to him and says, aha, that's exactly my point. This is the kind of popular claim that it's actually the Israelis who were the original owners of the land, and the Palestinians encroach on that. You can also see this in the rhetoric of the government, Netanyahu's government, which is a right-wing government that currently is in power in Israel, who refers to the land as Judea and Samaria rather than ever referring to it as Palestine. So the government actually adopts a kind of linguistic framework which erases the Palestinians and any picture of the Palestinians, and goes back to an ancient framework of Judea and Palestine just to make it a non-issue. This is also what makes archaeology in the region very strange. So if anybody's ever been to Israel, you might have gone to David's city, which is in part an archaeological park, or gone to one of the tunnels that runs along the wall of the temple. And these archaeological sites are actually run by Israeli settler organizations. One of the reasons that I haven't gone to them, I would very much like to go to them, but I really don't want my money going to Israeli settler organizations, which your money that you pay to get in there does. And that's because these archaeological digs are done in part to prove that the people of Israel had their foot here before the Palestinians did. And this leads to a really strange situation where archaeology is politicized in the region, and you have people coming out and making archaeological claims that it shouldn't be controversial, right? I mean, archaeologists should not be in the business of trying to establish land ownership. But they are. It also leads to some strange things on the Palestinian side. Yasser Arafat denied that the Temple Mount was the location where the temple was. And this is a popular move in Palestine, is to deny that the Temple Mount is where the temple ever was. There is no greater archaeological fact than that the Temple Mount does go back and was where the temple was in the 1st century. But they didn't want to admit it because they saw that as giving something over to the Israeli side by admitting that this was actually land that belonged at some point to the people of Israel. Now, in terms of moral analysis, well, I say this is kind of crazy. I don't know any place in the world where we establish ownership by going back and looking at where a group of people lived 2,000 years ago. And as some people have pointed out in the comments, if you go back that far by the account that you actually find in the scriptures of Israel, there were people that were there before Israel was there. This, by the way, ends up getting into a whole argument about DNA and the extent to which the current Palestinians are Arabs as opposed to the descendants of Canaanites. And this leads us into a whole historical morass because nobody even knows to what extent Israel was descendants of Canaanites, etc. I mean, the entire argument at that point really stops making sense. But it continues to function in the rhetoric exactly because it is a way of erasing the people of Palestine and the claim that there was a Palestinian people. The more recent form of this is to claim that there was no Palestinian state before the state of Israel. Again, it's a complicated claim to actually work through, but it's mostly rhetoric. It's true that there was no state of Palestine before there was a state of Israel, and that's because states were a novelty being brought in by Europeans at this point. The area had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire, but there had been a region of Palestine. That was actually the kind of development of the Roman name for the region. And under the Ottomans, it had its own district. Even under the Mamluks, it had its own district. And even from like 1928, there had been discussions of the Palestinian people under the British Mandate, which controlled the area at that time. So there were Palestinian peoples, and in some sense, it's just distracting from things to talk about whether there was a Palestinian state, but it is another one of those rhetorical means that are used to try and erase the other people. And that would be, I mean, I do want to understand the temptation of this, because if one side didn't really have a claim, then there would be a clearly just resolution. This would make things much easier in terms of moral balance when looking at the area, if any of these things were true. But ultimately, I think we have to say that they're rhetorical means of erasing the other side. And this is not limited to Israel erasing the Palestinians. Palestinians also have rhetorical means of erasing Israel and the people of Israel's claims in the land. I don't know, these might go more at what some people in this group, I suspect that you're more sympathetic to Palestinians. So hear me out on each of these, because I'm going to suggest that a couple of things that often get said about the state of Israel are morally inaccurate, okay? And that we should have better language for talking about these things. So one is the claim that Israel is a kind of colonial or imperial project. And you will often hear this in complaints from the pro-Palestinian side, saying that Israel is just a leftover of the colonial period, the imperial period, when Europe was going out and taking over the lands of indigenous people and colonizing them and taking their goods back. Now, there is the reason that this is complicated, of course, is that there are some ways in which the state of Israel does reflect the period of colonization and imperialism. In particular, that the state of Israel was founded, declared by the United Nations, which was primarily composed of colonial and imperialist powers. Colonial and imperialist powers that had come in and carved up the rest of the Middle East, in part to serve their own interests. It is also true that the state of Israel, that the colonial powers had interests. It wasn't just altruistic to put in the state of Israel in this region. There were political interests that they had in it, because most of the people that were moving down to Israel were Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, that could move down, that could inhabit this land, and that would give a foothold for European values in the region. Oftentimes you'll hear people who are pro-Israeli still talk about Israel as the one good state in a bad neighborhood, something that I think is obscurantist as much on the other side. Now, all of that is true. And so there are some things that the state of Israel has in common with colonial and imperial projects. The problem with calling it a colonial or imperial project, however, has to do with the fundamental motivation for the founding of Israel as it applies to the people of Israel. Because colonial projects were about going out and colonizing foreign areas from a home base in a colonizing country, and then bringing back the goods of that country to enrich the home base. Israel, while it does serve some of the interests of colonizing peoples, is not set up primarily for that purpose for the people of Israel. It is set up after the Holocaust as a means for them to gain security because they have no home base anyplace else. And when people who are Israeli hear the claim that Israel is simply an imperialist or colonial project. What they hear is, you really have a home base in Europe. You don't have any claim to the land here. There is no justification for this because you're all really just European colonialists coming into this area. And we have to understand how that sounds to people who are Israeli, because it sounds like you want to take away the basis for their security today and send them back to the place where they suffered the Holocaust. And that, calling them simply an imperial or a colonialist project, comes across to them as erasing them and what happened to them from the history and simply collapsing them back into Europe, where they came here because they didn't fit there. Another way that this is done, and again, this is language that has become very popular amongst some on the left. It was popularized by Jimmy Carter, and that's the claim that Israel basically runs an apartheid state. Now, again, the situation for this is complicated because there are some aspects of, say, an apartheid-like state that do fit with the state of Israel. If we look at the occupation of the West Bank and of Gaza, we have a minority populace in the people of Israel who rule over a larger populace in the West Bank, in Gaza, and inside parts of Israel, and who have disenfranchised those people. As I said, at current, the way it is set up, the state of Israel cannot be a democracy if it is going to maintain its status as a kind of ethno-state that protects the security of the Jewish people. And so in these ways, and in the continued harassment of people in the West Bank and in Gaza, this can look very much like what we think of as an apartheid state, the kinds of things that were going on in South Africa with the minority populace that's over a majority populace that is disenfranchising them. The problem with the language of apartheid, again, you have to process this as the people of Israel are going to hear it oftentimes. And that is that the problem of apartheid was that there was a colonial power that had come in and that they had taken over this land and that they were enforcing that over the majority. It wasn't a people who had come in and established a state for their own security and that were trying to maintain that state for their own security. The solution in South Africa was the enfranchisement of the majority and the allowance of that majority African populace to basically take over the state apparatus in South Africa. If that is the solution in Israel-Palestine, it functionally means the end of the state of Israel. Because if you move simply to an enfranchisement of everyone in the West Bank and everyone in Gaza, then the Jewish people will be a minority in that state. That is the outcome. And so, again, the language of apartheid, if you are Israeli, sounds like you are calling for the erasure of the state of Israel. And this language, I understand why it gets used, given the kind of abuses that Israel often undertakes. I don't know that it has the effect that people want it to have, because oftentimes it strengthens right-wing politics in Israel, right-wing politicians whose claim is that the rest of the world actually just wants to get rid of Israel. And that that language of treating Israel as an apartheid state can actually play into a right-wing narrative that keeps playing up fear in Israel, that the rest of the world is on the edge of just backing out and allowing Israel to collapse, and thus abandoning Israel's moral position in the conflict. So I've covered now, there is no one absolute just resolution to the conflict. Two, in order to come up with a just resolution, people often adopt language that in effect erases one side or the other. And then point three, which complicates the entire thing, is that you can't do anything in this region without paying attention to the balance of power. So one of the things, as a scholar that studies Reinhold Niebuhr was famously a Christian ethicist, and he held that a lot of justice was not about coming up with abstract formulas for figuring out what society should be like. It was about empowering different peoples so that they had the power to stand up for their own interests without overtaking other people's interests, so that you could have a balance of power that would be able to produce a relative justice in the light of the fact that oftentimes as human beings, we cannot produce an absolute justice. And this is part of the problem, a huge part of the problem in Israel-Palestine, because since 1947, Israel has really not lost a war and has not lost significant ground without granting it back to peoples. There was a period where they held the Sinai Peninsula and gave it back to Egypt, but they gave that back through a process of negotiation. They didn't lose it back to Israel in any significant sense. And this is in part because of their relation to colonial powers and Western powers, and their funding from those powers and the technology that it's able to get from those powers. At this point, the United States funds Israel and is embedded with Israel in weapons technology development in ways that it's not even clear that you could disentangle the United States from Israel in the development of these weapons. And so every time that foreign powers have infringed on Israel, Israel has tended to expand its power base, its land base in the region, and of course then to occupy the West Bank and Gaza. There was a unilateral withdrawal from occupation of Gaza in 2005, but that was not done primarily to limit the power of Israel or anything. It was done in order to be able to treat Gaza as a prison city that could be entirely shut off from the outside. As long as there were settlers inside from Israel, they couldn't do things like just turn off the water to the city, which they've done in recent days during their barrage. And of course, from the 1970s, really, you have the development of the settler movements, in part religious, in part the movement of Gush and Numim that moved out and believed that they are religiously called to take back the West Bank from Palestinian peoples. And the settler movement has now moved into the West Bank in ways that it's not clear how you would be able to pull them back out. The expansion of Israeli territory, often these people will go into Gaza or into the West Bank. They will burn down fields in order to drive people off of that land because people who are farmers, they need the land, they need that in order to keep going. They will burn down olive groves in order to move the people off of that. They will then occupy that land, and then the state of Israel feels the obligation to extend security to these people that have gone in and taken over Palestinian land. Most recently, the right-wing establishment in Israel under Netanyahu has found it more amenable to try and go back and forth with Hamas than it has to go back and forth with the Palestinian Authority over the West Bank, because the Palestinian Authority is a more moderate force. If the government of Israel had gone back and forth with the Palestinian Authority, they would have to take negotiations seriously, because the Palestinian Authority does recognize the right of the state of Israel to exist. And so Netanyahu has instead turned focus towards Hamas, where Hamas does not recognize the authority of Israel to exist, and in part has created this binary between the two in order to play up the fears of the people of Israel and to continue funding right-wing politics in Israel. Now, all of this has led to a massive power disparity between the state of Israel and the Palestinian peoples. And the power disparity has been so out of whack that really for the last, since about 2017, United States policy had just about given up on a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine. The United States had decided that other issues in the region were more important than the plight of the Palestinian peoples. And despite efforts in the past to bring about a two-state solution, Donald Trump, who is a phenomenon in politics, who did all sorts of things that nobody thought could be done, decided basically to abandon this two-state solution and instead to focus on getting Sunni states in the region to join with Israel in opposition to Iran, because the United States found Iran to be a bigger problem in the region that needed to be dealt with. And so they started negotiating with Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel so that the two of them could get together in facing off against Iran. In order to do this, they had to try and convince Saudi Arabia to abandon its interests in the Palestinian people, because that's what stands in the way of normalizing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So in part, Hamas's most recent activity may be in response to the United States and its shift in political interests in the region, where Hamas just saw that the Palestinian issue was going to get completely bowled over, and that they might be looking at, in effect, a kind of very slow-moving ethnic cleansing. So again, I'm not in favor of the language of genocide here. I think that gets thrown around way too much. And I would not describe anything that Israel does as genocide, but I think that they are in part doing a kind of slow-moving ethnic cleansing through the West Bank that is designed to push people out so that eventually they could have a one-state Israel solution. And that had just about been an accepted position. Even Biden had not really pushed back against this shift in American policy in the region. And in a strange way, Hamas's attack into Israel has actually shifted the conversation now, so that people, for the first time in the last 6 years, are talking about the issues of Palestine as if it is something that cannot be overlooked. This is a strange effect. I don't want to say anything could be positive in the outcome of Hamas's attack into Israel. It was horrific. It was abusive. But it has focused people back on the region. Now, whether that is enough to actually get anyone to buy into the process of creating two states is highly questionable, because anybody who does, it costs them massive political capital. It has to be the United States that is involved, because only the United States could have any power in Israel in order to get Israel to accept any negotiated solution to the problems of Israel-Palestine. And no president has even felt like talking about that since Obama. And largely Obama did it in his first year, and he learned a political lesson that he was going to have to use a lot of political capital, and it was unlikely for him to get success. And so he backed off of it after his first year. The real question then at this point is whether there is the political will to undertake the movements of power that would be necessary to bring about a greater power balance between the two that could lead to a negotiated settlement. I don't have great optimism about this, not only because it's been a mess throughout recent history, but because the United States, in order to do this, would have to have a long, settled process and policy that remained consistent over a long period of time. And the United States is not politically coherent at this point in ways that are likely to underwrite this. So is there any possibility to move in that direction? We could see what it would look like to move in that direction. Is it possible? I don't know. Is it likely? Certainly not. But that is the direction that you have to go in order to get a morally balanced approach to the problem of Israel-Palestine. And so that's what I had to say today to you. I hope that that all makes sense.